When the stock market crashed at the end of 1929, most Americans were very poor before the stock market crash, so they didn't see an immediate impact. What they felt and experienced was the response of the wealthiest people who immediately saw the impact from these dips in the market around the world. And it didn't take long for this, what folks thought of as a recession or a dip in the economy, to truly become a depression. And when Hoover entered the White House in 1929, he spent a lot of time assuring Americans that the nation was in a strong financial state and that the elimination of poverty was very near. Now, remember, through the 1920s, everyone from all economic brackets is experiencing about a 32% increase in their income. So even the poorest have a little more money, but they don't have a lot of money and they don't have any savings. Recall from chapter 21, only about 20 to 25% of Americans had any savings. That, of course, is the wealthiest Americans and that upper middle class. But the other thing that takes place in the 1920s is more people are buying new items on credit. And when the Depression hits, there are a lot of people who have been living on credit and not actual income. And what happens as a result of that is when there is a depression, there's suddenly no credit, which means suddenly people have nothing. As president, Herbert Hoover embraced laissez-faire to a lesser extent than his predecessors had. He advocated for a voluntary partnership between business and government and a relationship in which the government would try to influence the economy, but only to the extent that it might promote sensible behavior. Recall that laissez-faire is this idea of the government not regulating business and kind of staying out of that area and allowing the market to regulate itself. Now, Hoover hoped that a continued reliance on this voluntary partnership would be successful in ending the Great Depression. He urged industries to keep prices low so that people could still buy the things that they needed. He also encouraged industries to keep wages stable, not to cut wages until the Depression had ended, with the hope that those who were struggling would still be able to make some of the ends meet. And then he believed that those who were the most poor, the most vulnerable, could be best aided during this time by the help of private charities. Now, you may recall from the previous chapters, the wealthiest Americans have been spending a lot of money to help charities and to set up different organizations to help immigrants, to help poor Americans survive and make their ends meet. And Hoover believes that this is the best way to encourage people to look for jobs and to continue working, but also to ensure that basic needs are met. But volunteerism in the face of spreading economic despair was very difficult to sell for Hoover. Local governments were unable to sustain their own economies. Private agencies did not have enough funds, enough capital to provide relief for the many, many people who needed assistance. Businesses had no confidence in government, and they didn't abide by Hoover's request for this voluntary relationship. Tax revenues fell And by 1933, more than 1,300 homes, 300 towns had completely gone bankrupt. Chicago and other cities no longer had the money to pay their teachers, which means that either these teachers would need to work for free or the students would not be able to go to school. Mass unemployment spread completely out of control, and the situation worsened. And as the situation continues to get worse and worse, Hoover recognizes that he really doesn't have a choice. He's going to have to make some changes. Congress lowered income tax and authorized a $423 million public works spending package. In 1929, Hoover signed into law the Agricultural Marketing Act, which provided relief for farmers. The government was facing an increasing deficit, however, and in 1932, Hoover and Congress raised taxes on the very wealthy. This exacerbated the problems of slow production, declining investments, and increasing unemployment. Now, remember, Hoover believes that the way to address these issues is by ensuring that taxes on the wealthiest are low so that the wealthiest will be encouraged to create new businesses and to make some risky investments in creating new mills, new factories, so that people will be able to find jobs. The Hawley-Smoot Act of 1930 increased the tariff rates. Now, this means that it would now cost more money for you to import an item from another country. This is very good for American businesses because it means that the consumer will be incentivized to purchase a product from the United States. But when Hoover does this with that Hawley-Smoot Act, it upsets the other countries, and so they respond by increasing their own duties, which means that now it will cost more to get American products in another country. So the demand for American products slowed. So with the decrease in the demand for American products around the world, this impacts the Depression and makes things worse. Hoover made another effort to create relief. He authorized the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC. Now, this agency kept banks, insurance companies, and railroads afloat, and the government really believes, they really hope that this measure will produce dividends that will flow from the top of the economy to the bottom of the economy. So we're still are operating under the belief and the hope that by making more money flow at the top, it will flow to the bottom. With an operating budget of $1.5 billion, the RFC hoped to hire people for public works projects and provide some economic aid to those that were struggling the most. But the RFC was very, very cautious with their spending. They were afraid to invest it, they were afraid to take risks, and so the wealth never trickles down to benefit the poorest people. Hoover refused to extend government welfare to the individuals who were struggling the most. And the argument that Hoover and many others made was that if more and more people were receiving these bailouts, this government aid, they would be less incentivized to work. They would become more reliant on a government handout, and they would create the government itself would create this problem of having too many people dependent. Now, the Great Depression in the United States was only part of a global economic collapse. Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal all faced unemployment crises at the same time. Now, with this unemployment crisis, we see widespread poverty and frustration with government, frustration with our political leaders. Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal are areas that the Depression really facilitates the rise of authoritarian dictators. Now, we see unemployment trends from the beginning of 1920 through 1945. And so what we see is that in 1920, about 5% of Americans are unemployed. Now, that's really pretty normal. There are, at any given time, the unemployment rate can be about 5%, and that's not considered anything overly alarming on a national level. We see some periods in about 1924 to 1930 where the unemployment rate is very low. This is a good time in the United States. Now, part of that is connected to the fact that we've had that shift in mechanization, and we have more people who are working, a greater demand for products. That greater demand for products, again, is connected to the reality that a lot of people are buying now on credit and planning to pay for those items later. But by 1930, we see that the unemployment rate spikes very quickly. After the stock market crashed in 1929, people lost their jobs, they lost their homes, their cars, the things in their homes. They really lost everything. And the unemployment rate is at about 25%. That is the highest that it has been at any point in our nation's history. And even in 2009, when we had what we called the Great Recession, the unemployment rate didn't go above 15%. The situation in the United States grew increasingly desperate as families who lacked the sufficient clothing to stay warm crowded into urban apartments where they had no gas or electricity. They cooked their meals outdoors on fires, and in the most desperate of scenarios, the homeless constructed makeshift shelters out of cartons, cardboard, newspaper, and excess cloth in neighborhoods that were called Hoovervilles. Hungry, homeless people lived beneath bridges and in wrecked cars, and in an extreme situation, 50 starving men fought over food scraps thrown out of a Chicago restaurant. For rural dwellers, evictions and foreclosures created a housing crisis, and the climate was equally cruel. Between 1929 and 1933, dust storms consumed the Great Plains and part of the Southwest, destroying agriculture, vegetation, and farm life. Now, this was about a 4-year period of constant storms in which the dust would be so thick that you couldn't see the person sitting across from you. And the dust was so extensive that it would seep into your home even with the doors and windows closed. It would seep through the crevices. And people would have their lungs completely filled with dust, and they would die. They would suffocate from the dust. Children were especially susceptible, as were the elderly, and there really wasn't anything that you could do other than to try to keep the dust away from your face and try to survive through the times that the storms were bad. The climate played a role in the dust storms, but the plains farmers had laid the groundwork for this crisis by not planting trees or grass alongside the wheat. That would have, of course, prevented the erosion of the earth. Some people knew, most people most farmers didn't really know or understand the need to properly um, plant the land and make sure that there was grass and trees. But also, remember, this is at the end of the 1920s, after a time when we have been trying to plant to excess to have an income and so that families can survive. About 3/4 of the plains dwellers stayed on their farms. So again, about 75%, the majority, stay on the farms and suffer through the Depression and the dust storms. Millions of others migrated to California with the hopes of finding relief, but they were met with derision from the Californians in the area. Although some Okies, as they were called, were able to set up meaningful lives in the West. Although the bulk of the newly unemployed workers in the Great Depression were white men, African Americans and Latinos confronted an even steeper uphill battle during the Depression, in part because they had been held back by discrimination for so long. The vast majority of African Americans continued to reside in the agricultural South, working on farms as tenants and sharecroppers, stuck in debt and facing eviction by the landowners who were equally saddled with debt. The average annual wage for African Americans was about $200. Now, that's the average annual wage. So the average for the year is about $200 for African Americans. Now, that's about 25% less than the average annual salary earned by white workers. So just to make sure that's clear, the average white family is earning between $800 and $1,000 a year, but less than 25% of what a white worker family would earn is what African American families are living on. In addition to low wages and discriminatory practices, the United States clung to white supremacy, and the economic woes of the Depression aggravated racial tensions. Lynching rates increased for the first time in nearly a decade. In 1931, two white women named Ruby Bates and Victoria Price hopped onto a freight train, and after a fight broke out between black and white men on top of the women's freight car, the sheriff of Scottsboro arrested 9 black youths for assault. The two women subsequently accused the black men of rape. The Scottsboro 9, who ranged in age from 12 to 21 years old, were nearly lynched, but survived long enough to stand trial. They were quickly found guilty, and all but one were sentenced to death. The Communist Party took the defense of the young men, and the case reached the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court overturned the guilty verdicts in 1932 and 1935, but only on technicalities. So the Supreme Court just said that there were improprieties in the case. Bates later recanted her testimony, and there was no evidence of rape. But the 9 men were retried in 1936 and 1937 and were found guilty both times. 4 of the 9 saw their charges dropped by 1937, but one of the defendants remained in jail until 1950. For Latinos, particularly those in the Southwest and the West, migrant farm labor was not a lucrative source of income during the Depression. In the face of an unemployment crisis, The government began to deport Mexican workers, and many left the country voluntarily. Those who stayed received unequal relief, faced discrimination in public accommodation and voting rights, as well as in education, and were underpaid and overworked. For Mexican laborers who were not American citizens, creating a path to resist labor exploitation was difficult. But in San Antonio, Texas, in the early 1930s, Luisa Moreno led a 5-week strike by pecan shellers who won better wages. Asian Americans were economically and politically isolated as a result of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the National Origins Act. The Japanese population in the United States faced severe job discrimination, making the Depression especially difficult. During the 1930s, about 20% of Japanese immigrants returned to Japan. Chinese immigrants struggled as well. Those who did not obtain governmental relief relied on community organizations for help. Filipinos in the United States faced hostility when Congress passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934. The United States simultaneously gave the Philippines its independence and restricted Filipino immigration to the United States. As unemployment skyrocketed, women not only had to care for their families, but also had to support their husbands, who struggled without their traditional role as breadwinner. Women's ability to make money became essential in the context of the Depression. They earned lower wages in fields such as domestic service, nursing, and office work, but they were less likely to be fired. The government attempted to create more jobs for men by banning married women from working in civil service or teaching positions, but the proportion of women in the workforce had grown by about 25% in 1940. The percentage of African American women with jobs exceeded that of white women who worked outside of the home, but unemployment rates for Black women still reached as much as 50% during the Depression. In spite of their financial situation, most American families held together and survived the crisis by budgeting carefully and finding outlets for entertainment. Henry Ford and his employees felt the pinch of the Great Depression. Ford slashed his employees' wages early in the 1930s, and in 1932, communists organized a protest in which 3,000 auto workers marched from Detroit to Dearborn. Police fired bullets and tear gas, killing 4 protesters. Communists were not the only protesters. A group of 20,000 World War I veterans wanted to receive their service bonuses early and marched on Washington, D.C. They were called the Bonus Army. They set up camp and they waited to hear from Congress. Congress failed to pass a bill that would provide the service bonuses early, and Hoover refused to negotiate with the Bonus Army. General Douglas MacArthur and George S. Patton used force to drive the demonstrators from their camp, setting fire to their tents, and 1 marcher was killed. More than 100 were wounded. Hoover's inability to work with the bonus army and his failure to provide economic relief decimated his popularity. He appeared to be out of touch with ordinary Americans who were desperately poor. Now, it is important to understand that the bonus army is only asking for money that they have already been promised. They're just asking for it early. Remember, Hoover's concern was that government handouts would create a group of people that were dependent, and so he opposed them, and many others opposed a bailout. But these people in the bonus army are only asking for the funds that they've already been promised. Here we see between 1932 and 1942, there is farm foreclosures, people who are losing their homes, they're losing their farms. We see that begin to spike back at the beginning of the Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt easily won the presidency in 1932 after making campaign promises that he would change the way the government handled the Depression. He agreed to try various strategies and give more support to, quote, the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid, end quote. Roosevelt believed that practical approaches to the nation's problems would create more significant changes for its citizens, and he won the reputation for taking concrete action to improve ordinary people's lives. Though not all of his policies succeeded in effecting significant change, he was vastly popular among the American public. Roosevelt sought to rally the nation with his first inaugural address, in which he told Americans that, quote, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, end quote. He embraced the idea of communicating with the public via fireside chats, which were broadcast over the radio, and hoped that they would help to sustain public morale through the difficult times. Recall from the previous chapter, the majority of Americans have a radio in their home, and they turn on the radio for news, for information, and for entertainment. So Roosevelt is really the first president in our nation's history to try to find a way to connect directly to the American public. Roosevelt's New Deal program encompassed a number of economic reforms whose goals were to create millions of jobs, increase prices for farmers, restore financial stability, and save capitalism. Roosevelt's first step in providing relief was to close all of the banks for several days in an effort to quell the panic that Americans were in after losing their savings. Soon afterward, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act, which forced banks to pass an inspection by the Treasury Department before they could be reopened. Congressional passage of the Glass-Steagall Act in June of 1933 created the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, the FDIC, which was established to protect personal savings accounts and separate commercial banks from investment banks. To this day, if you go into a bank, you will see a sticker that says FDIC insured. And if you don't see that sticker, don't put your money in that bank. 1 year later, Roosevelt created the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to regulate the stock market with the aim of preventing the type of collapse that some people felt had triggered the American economic decline. As part of his efforts to balance the federal budget, Roosevelt facilitated the end of Prohibition with the passage and ratification of the 21st Amendment, allowing the government to tax alcohol sales and eliminating the cost of Prohibition enforcement. Remember, with the 18th Amendment, with Prohibition, it was illegal to buy, sell, manufacture, distribute, carry across state lines any form of alcohol. And so there were these agents who would investigate this particular crime. Even though it was a crime and there was an active effort to prosecute those who committed this offense, we actually saw an increase in the amount of alcohol that was being consumed, because people were kind of interested in this new thing that they were being denied now. So with the repeal of Prohibition, what we see is the government doesn't need to pay these people to go out and investigate, but they're also able to now tax the sale of alcohol because that's considered a luxury item, not a necessity. FDR won the support of progressives by following the advice of his wife, Eleanor, and appointing Frances Perkins to head the Department of Labor. Perkins was the first woman to head a cabinet agency. In May of 1933, Congress created the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which paid farmers subsidies to cut the production, slaughter excess livestock, plow overplanted fields in an effort to raise prices. By 1935, the farm income had increased by 50%. Farmers profited off of the AAA in part by evicting tenant farmers and sharecroppers rather than giving them a portion of the subsidies, meaning that in spite of the relief, Black agricultural workers continued to suffer. In the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was established in 1933, worked on rural electrification and revitalization of the Tennessee Valley region through flood control projects. Roosevelt also established the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, which regulated the production, wages, prices, and collective bargaining with the intent of increasing the consumer purchasing power and fostering business growth. The NRA undertook a public relations campaign to get businesses and industries to join up and display the NRA's blue eagle symbol. But most businesses did not control prices as anticipated, and the NRA displayed lackluster support for collective bargaining. The organization failed to create its desired recovery, and in 1935, the Supreme Court ruled that the NRA was unconstitutional. To provide more direct relief to struggling Americans, Roosevelt created the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the FERA, which helped states to recover from bankruptcy. The FRE was headed by Harry Hopkins, who spent its appropriations quickly, citing ordinary people's daily needs. Now, remember that states aren't even able to pay their own debts. Cities and towns can't pay their teachers. So everyone and businesses as well as the actual agencies, the governments, are impacted. With the FERA, Hopkins spends the money very quickly and he lists the needs that people have, the day-to-day needs, as the justifications for spending this money. Infrastructure projects took center stage early in the New Deal. Under the direction of Harold Ickes, the Public Works Administration built dams, bridges, schools, buildings, sewage plants, port cities, and hospitals. The Civil Works Administration, a collaborative initiative by Roosevelt and Hopkins, offered employment on infrastructure projects to more than 4 million Americans in order to help people survive the winter. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was run by the Army and put single young men to work in forests, parks, and beaches, and on bridges and dams. The men wore uniforms, slept in camps, and earned $1 a day, with the government sending $25 of their monthly wages directly to their families. Now, the New Deal was not without its critics. In spite of Roosevelt's efforts, the recovery was very slow. 20% of the population remained unemployed by 1935. So we've only seen a 5% decline over the previous 5.5 years. Roosevelt faced criticism on the right and the left, so from Republicans and Democrats, because of the slow pace of change. Right-wing critics feared that the New Deal spending signaled big government, and the left-wing critics argued that Roosevelt's policies did not go far enough to provide relief for the masses, or dismantle expansive corporate wealth and power. Corporations took on the task of spreading conservative values as the Republican Party struggled to regroup in the face of Hoover's poor response to the Great Depression. In 1934, the DuPont Corporation and General Motors established the American Liberty League. The American Liberty League argued that Americans needed to be encouraged to work and accumulate wealth, and that the New Deal was nothing more than a socialist or a communist plot led by Roosevelt, whom they likened to a dictator. The organization was not large, but it attracted Northern industrialists, bankers, and Democrats. The Communist Party grew in the 1930s, with its membership peaking at about 75,000. In 1938, workers and African Americans joined the party in response to its unionization efforts and its representation of the Scottsboro Nine. In addition, the party built relationships with and influenced a range of left-leaning organizations in the fields of civil rights and organized labor. But by the end of the 1970s, membership began to decline as the negative aspects of the Soviet Union and its policies began to come to light. Among Roosevelt's strongest critics was a retired doctor named Francis Townsend, who suggested that the government give individuals over 60 a $200 monthly pension that they had to spend. Townsend argued that this would encourage people to retire, and it would stimulate employment opportunities for younger people. And it would also have money paid in stipends, which would contribute to economic growth. This probably sounds a little bit like Social Security. That's also something that the Populist Party was advocating for way back in the 1890s. Townsend's plan was vastly popular, and Townsend clubs boasted 3.5 million members by 1936. Charles E. Coughlin was another Roosevelt critic. He was a Catholic priest from Michigan and used his national radio broadcast to argue that Roosevelt's New Deal served only the interests of bankers, communists, and Jews. Eventually, his anti-Semitism and support for fascist dictatorships overseas led to the demise of his program. In politics, Huey Pierce Long challenged Roosevelt, first as the governor of Louisiana and later as a U.S. Senator. Long argued that the New Deal failed to achieve its goal and concentrated the wealth in the hands of a few. Long established the Share Our Wealth Society and promised to give each family a $5,000 homestead and a guaranteed annual income of $2,000 to be funded by income and inheritance taxes on the wealthy. Long had a vast and diverse array of supporters, but he was murdered in 1935. Though many Americans benefited early from the New Deal measures, many others were left out. In 1935, Roosevelt resolved to provide more relief by increasing the government spending. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, was modeled on the Civil Works Administration and created jobs for about 8.5 million Americans who built or repaired roads, bridges, airports, and public buildings. The WPA created the Federal Writers Project, the Federal Art Project, the Federal Music Project, and the Federal Theater Project to help employ writers, artists, and musicians, and to provide support for the production of cultural works. Among the writers the WPA employed were Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, Clifford Odets, Saul Bellow, John Cheever, and Margaret Walker. Painters created murals in and on government buildings, and historians and folklorists composed state histories and conducted oral histories with former slaves. These historians were good historians, and when they went to interview these former slaves, many of them who had real memories because they were adults when slavery was ended, and those who had been born in slavery but had lived their whole lives in the Jim Crow South, these historians would ask questions and they would write the dialogue of the slave. And so when we read these works, when we read these narratives, we read them just as if we are listening to the person tell their life story. The National Youth Administration employed college students and high school students along with people who were just out of school, offering them the experience of working in offices, repairing cars, building hospital wards, and revitalizing school buildings. Mary McLeod Bethune led the NYA's Division of Negro Affairs, which sought to ensure the agency's programs would benefit Black youths as well as white youths. Now, the WPA did not pay the workers a living wage. Only one family member could participate, and wages were especially low for women. Additionally, it's important to note that those who were in the artist program did make a little bit more money. In 1935, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act to help aid the elderly by providing pensions that were supported by payroll taxes, and it also supported unemployment, the disabled, and children who were dependent on single parents. The Social Security Act fell short when it came to race. As for other political reasons, it intentionally excluded farm workers and domestic servants. workers who were disproportionately African American. To get the law to pass, Roosevelt needed the support of Southern Democrats who pushed for the exclusions of those farm workers and domestic servants. The payroll tax to fund pensions hit low-wage earners the hardest, and for women, Social Security did not account for the unpaid work of raising their children and maintaining a home. Social Security nonetheless transformed working people's lives, giving workers a stake in the government's efforts to maintain the program, creating alliances between the workforce and the government, and increasing the size of the middle class for the Democratic Party. The National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, which was passed in 1935, protected workers' right to organize unions, and the 1930s saw a dramatic increase in union membership. In 1935, the Congress of Industrial Organizations was established to provide industrial workers with representation unavailable in the craft union or the American Federation of Labor. 2 years later, the CIO had 4.5 million workers and engaged in more than 4,700 strikes. Women affiliated with the union were called union maids and formed the Women's Emergency Brigade, which provided supplies to workers and helped buoy their spirits when they engaged in a sit-down strike at the General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan. The strike was successful, and after 6 weeks, GM recognized the union. Roosevelt went further than most prior presidents to create opportunities for African Americans by establishing the informal black cabinet, desegregating federal offices and facilities, and creating the Civil Liberties Unit of the Department of Justice. In 1936, black voters contributed to a significant electoral shift, switching their loyalties from Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party to Roosevelt's Democrats. Roosevelt's New Deal measures, however, did not go far among African Americans, who still faced discrimination and low wages and enjoyed only limited benefits from New Deal programs like the Social Security Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. The New Deal only partially aided Native Americans, most of whom lived on reservations established in 1877. Native Americans earned significantly less than their white counterparts. In 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act, or the IRA, which reversed the Dawes Act and provided self-government and cultural autonomy for the reservations. The IRA failed to recognize the various tribes that had diverse political and economic practices. The Seneca, the Crow, the Navajo, and other native tribes outright rejected the Indian Reorganization Act. Roosevelt easily won re-election in 1936, signaling an important electoral shift by attracting an uncommon assortment of voters, comprised of a coalition of farmers, urban immigrants, white Southerners, the poor, union members, and African Americans. Roosevelt is the first president in many, many decades to really draw on the diverse groups of Americans to win an election. Roosevelt, however, quickly faced challenges and opposition when he proposed increasing the size of the Supreme Court through a court packing plan that would allow him to appoint 6 additional judges so as to prevent the overturning of his New Deal legislations. The opponents of the court packing plan argued that Roosevelt's behavior was dictatorial, which was a very loaded charge in the context of the rising number of dictatorships in Europe. The plan failed. The Supreme Court nonetheless approved the Wagner Act and the Social Security Act, but Roosevelt's reputation suffered. Critics feared that Roosevelt was going too far in amassing power, and Southern Democrats created a conservative coalition that blocked important legislation through the use of filibusters. The Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 passed through Congress and created a 40 cent an hour minimum wage and a 40-hour work week. Now, remember, one of the things that the populace wanted way back in the 1890s was a 40-hour work week and a minimum wage. So the Fair Labor Standards Act requires that employees be paid a minimum of 40 cents per hour and not be expected to work more than a 40-hour work week without some kind of compensation. In 1937, a recession hit, and this coincided with the court packing battle and Roosevelt's declining popularity. The recession resulted in a reduction in government spending, which led to a spike in unemployment at the same time that the Social Security payroll tax went into effect. This put less money in the consumers' pockets. The New Deal still had not resolved the Depression by 1939. Unemployment was at 17%. Nearly 2/3 of Americans were very poor, and the distribution of wealth very uneven. In this context, Roosevelt saw his popularity suffer, but he began to turn his attention to the mounting war in Europe.